on sea container and cargo cleanliness, your say. For that, I'd like to first give the floor to Stephanie Bloom, who is the NAPPO Executive Director and Coordinator of JIXV. She will be today's moderator.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. As the regional plant protection organization that is coordinating our group, the JIXV group for the next biennium, I want to welcome you on behalf of the 5 RPPOs. We are very happy to see the attendance of so many friends from the Americas. Thank you very much. We will hear some welcome remarks from our hosts at IICA, and we will hear from our 2 main organizers, Wendy Aspel and Wendy Belts, from the North American countries of Canada and the US. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And greetings, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. I am Ana Marisa Cordero. I am the coordinator of the Food Safety and Plant Protection Program at IICA. And on behalf of IICA, I'd like to welcome all of you to our event. And very especially, I'd like to welcome all our strategic alliances and partners in this process, and very especially those who have worked with us in this initiative, the JIXV group, to ensure we can develop this webinar and other activities. I'd also like to thank the official agencies and representatives joining us today, all our attendees, as well as our speaker. Thank you very much for showing attention and for participating today. To all attendees joining us as well, thank you for your interest. The topic that joins us today is especially from the plant protection standpoint, and given the complexity it implies in operational terms. The main objective for today is to see how we can discuss this, share experiences, hear from others, and identify common interest topics that can help us find alternatives to work together on this matter. This is an objective we have for the whole program, exchanging experiences and promoting discussion and dialogue. This helps us find areas for action and cooperation. And that way we can bring topics of interest for the industry, for official services, and for IICA and others. With that, I wish you all the best, a very productive seminar, and thank you very much for participating.
Perhaps we can now hear from Wendy Aspel and Wendy Belts with their welcoming remarks. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Wendy Aspel. I am a co-chair of the North American Sea Container Initiative. And on behalf of the NASCI group, I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon for a very good discussion and information sharing on sea container and cargo cleanliness. Firstly, to IICA and NAPPO, we are grateful for for arranging and coordinating this webinar and for providing the logistics and translation. In fact, your enthusiasm and support for this webinar are truly inspiring. Thank you. We're equally thankful for the participation of our co-presenters from the governments of New Zealand and Australia, as well as the World Shipping Council and the Global Shippers Forum. And in fact, some of them are joining at very early or late times of the day, which is truly a testament to their commitment to this very important and complex global issue. But most of all, we thank you all for attending, because it's your views and input and ideas that are the most important part of this session. And we're looking forward to hearing from you. I just want to note that in the webinar invitation, there was a link to a pre-webinar survey. If you have not yet had the chance to do the survey, I will momentarily be including the links in the chat. And after the presentations, we'll also provide links to a post-webinar survey. And with that, again, thank you. I will turn it over to my co-chair, Wendy Beltz.
Thank you, Wendy. And I too want to thank IICA and NAPPO for pulling this webinar together, and again, their enthusiasm behind it. This is a global issue, as we can tell by the participants on this webinar. And so we really look forward to showing you what we've done in our countries, and to really hear from you on what you have happening in your countries. What challenges do you have, and maybe some things that you're putting into place that we haven't even thought of yet. So I will stop there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Marisa. Thank you very much, Wendy Aspel and Wendy Beltz. I will briefly introduce our first speaker this afternoon, who is a Senior Vice President of the World Shipping Council. I've known Lars for many years, and he is an authority on the movement of sea containers, and has really opened the eyes of all of us interested in this issue on the complexity of containers that move goods around the world. So without further ado, Lars, welcome, and please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and also thank you to IICA for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I would also like to stress, as my NASCI colleagues Wendy and Wendy emphasized, container cleanliness, pest infestation using containers and their cargoes as the vectors is a joint concern, and it's also a joint responsibility. And I can only confirm on behalf of the World Shipping Council and its members that we take this issue very seriously, and we want to work with governments represented here and globally to try to reduce, to minimize this risk. Maribel, thank you so much for taking control of my PowerPoint. If you would kindly move to the next slide, please. I will not spend too much time about what the World Shipping Council is. It suffices to say that the members of the World Shipping Council are ocean carriers, liner shipping companies, and in a moment I will show you a photo so you get an idea of what liner shipping is. Our 19 member companies combined represent more than 90% of the global liner shipping capacity. and they operate the overwhelming majority of the world's fleet of containers. They own some of those containers, the rest they lease in, but I want you to know that we are the principal operators of containers everywhere in the world. And next slide, please. I have tried with these two photos to, in a nutshell, describe what liner shipping is. On the one, on the left, you have a typical container ship. Probably this ship has around 18,000, maybe 15,000 containers on it. Whereas the ship to the right is what we call a ro-ro or vehicle carrier, moving cars, tractors, earth-moving equipment, cranes around the world. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this statistics to you, not for you to remember, of course, but if you go to the far right column, total units, those are the physical container units that my members move annually around the world. You will see that since 2018, we are moving at 220 million containers. Those are container trips. There are approximately 25 million containers owned and operated by my members, but because each container is moved 5-6 times each annually, that is why you come up to this number. And of course, we also need to reposition the empty containers. And I will show that repositioning in a moment. So even with a pandemic in 2020, you will see that my members did a combined container trips, physical units being moved from country A to country B, maybe via a country C in a transshipment port, 221 million containers. So it gives you an idea of the size of the industry, but also from a pest contamination point of view, of course, a perception of what the challenge really is in terms of units. And then if I may go to the next slide. I will now show you a couple of slides that I have put together to illustrate the complexity of how containers move. And I use these 4 symbols. You will see under symbol, a stack of containers that represent container depots. Those are depots that we, the liner shipping companies, operate ourselves, or that we contract with a third-party provider to operate for us, where containers are inspected and they are cleaned. Then you have the factory with a chimney that represents where containers are either packed or unpacked. Then below that, you have a crane with some containers that represents a container terminal. And then at the bottom, a container vessel. So Maribel, if you would move to the next slide, please. This is, I have tried to capture what most people think is going on within the container industry. And of course, this is not any derogatory intent on my part, because why would people who are not dealing with containerization and supply chains think otherwise? But most people think that containers moved in a closed loop. So if you take the export country in the upper right corner, green arrows represent empty containers, red arrows represent full containers. People think that containers come in empty, all empties into the export country. They are unloaded. They go to a container depot where they are all inspected and cleaned, and then move to a factory where they are packed, Then they go full to a terminal, loaded onto a ship that then comes into an import country, discharge the containers. They are being carried to a factory or an unpacking point, consignee location, where they are unpacked, they are empty and go back to a terminal, onto a ship, and then you have the circle repeating itself. Next slide, please. The reality is much more complex, and this is just the start of the complexity I'm going to deal with. I have in this slide tried to distinguish between, at the bottom, countries that import fewer containers than they export. Think typically China, and then surplus locations up top, think the United States. So if you take the bottom, the demand locations, again, think China, there are ships coming into China that have on board some containers that are packed with cargo, machinery, or other products, but mostly containers are empty when they come into China. The containers are discharged. Think Shanghai, the world's biggest container port. The full containers go to the consignee location where they unpacked, whereas the empty containers either go to a container depot, but in many instances, they skip the container depot. They go straight to the exporter's location where they then are packed. They are trucked or railed or by barge to a container terminal. They are loaded onto the ship full, and then the ship comes into, let's say, Los Angeles on the US West Coast, where the containers are being discharged. They go in normal circumstances without the impact of the COVID that has created a severe congestion everywhere in the supply chain. The containers will go full to the consignee, be unpacked. They will go to from there, either via a container depot or straight to the export terminal. And I want to stress that containers do not always go, whether we are talking in the demand location, China, or in the surface location, the United States, they do not necessarily go via a container depot. The container depot is where the carrier, the container operator, my members, have control over the carrier, over the container, and can inspect the container and clean it. But as you will see from this slide, not all containers go via a container depot, meaning that we cannot clean a container we don't have custody over. Next slide, please. Then I want to introduce hub and spoke. This is no different than many of you have seen in the airline industry, where they are big hub airports where smaller planes fly passengers in order for those passengers to board a bigger trans-Pacific or transatlantic flight. The same with the containers. So to the right in this slide, we have feeder vessels. Feeder vessels that serve smaller ports. Think typically, but not exclusively, ports in the Caribbean. They will bring, if we take the upper feeder vessel, will bring containers both full and empty into a hub port. Colón in Panama or other ports. Freeport in the Bahamas is actually also a big hub port, where the containers both empty as well as are being loaded onto what we in industry call a mainline vessel, bottom left hand, and that mainline vessel will then take both the empty containers and the packed containers to a bigger port on its itinerary. That port could be somewhere, say in Brazil, it could be via the Panama Canal up to A or Long Beach, or the Panama Canal to the Pacific. And then you have in the upper left right corner, you have a container ship, a mainline vessel coming in with packed containers and empty containers. They are being discharged. And then some of those empty containers, the green containers, and the packed containers, the red ones, are taken by feeder vessel to a smaller port in the area. Next slide. Then containers do not just originate kilometers, if not thousands of kilometers away from either a feeder port or a mainline port. And here I tried to illustrate, you have a container depot up in the upper left corner. An empty container is dispatched to an exporter's factory where it's packed. Then the full container, the red arrow, the container goes to an inland terminal that will load the container onto a barge. And then the barge will take the container to a seaport where the container is then loaded onto either a main haul vessel, which is this illustrate, or it could be a feeder vessel that then would sail to one of the transshipment ports in the hub and spoke system. Next slide, please. And believe me, I'm not inventing this to just make you confused about my industry. I'm adding this to show the challenge we all are in on where and how we could get hold of the container to inspect it for cleanliness, where it would be appropriate to inspect it and clean it. And in this hugely complex mosaic of various movements, I also wanted to introduce what we in the industry jargon refer to as street turns. So upper right corner, you have a full container ship with full containers coming into a port. The containers are discharged, the red arrows going down to the factory where the container is unpacked. And instead of the empty container going to a terminal to be loaded direct to a ship, the container can go from one exporter directly down the street, therefore the term street turns, directly down the street where there is an exporter waiting to get an empty container to load his or her export articles. The container then is full, the red arrow to the terminal on the left-hand side, loaded onto a ship, and then you have the process starting all over. Next slide, please. Here I have included some examples, and I realize I should have included examples from the Caribbean and South America, but bear with me. If you look at trip 1, this is from Linz in Austria to Guangzhou in China. Pack point 1, that's where the container is being packed. It is then trucked to an inland terminal on the Danube River and onto a barge. It then is barged to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where it is loaded onto a main haul vessel, the red line, main line. Then that container is transshipped in Algeciras in Spain, transshipment hub 1 and 2, go through the Suez Canal, Indian Ocean onto Singapore, where the container is transshipped once again onto a another mainline ship onto Guangzhou, import terminal 1, and then trucked to unpack point 1. And then there's another example I've used for New Zealand. You will see the pack point 2, and that is where the exporter, the New Zealand exporter, is located. The container is being packed, is being trucked to the biggest port in New Zealand, port of Tauranga, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Sina. And then it's taken by feeder vessel to Singapore, loaded onto a main haul ship, going up via the Indian Ocean, up the Suez Canal, Mediterranean, to Algeciras in Spain, transshipped again, and then going up to on a main haul vessel to an import terminal in the UK, Felixstowe. It's discharged there and put on a truck to the unpack point in the UK. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show you, this is a real example of one of my member companies. It's OOCL based in Hong Kong. They introduced this service just 10 days ago. So they now have regular container trains departing Xi'an in China, going up to Kaliningrad in Russia, where the containers are being discharged, going on feeder vessels to Bremerhaven in Germany, where the containers then are loaded onto mainline vessels going to New York, Charleston, or Savannah. There are very specific reasons, namely congestion on the US West Coast, that has triggered this new innovation. But it also, of course, for you as regulators and enforcers of pest rules and requirements, now introduce new challenges for you. If you think about how many touch points this container on that train loaded in Xi'an will have before it ends up, in this example, in New York or the hinterland of New York. Next slide, please. I'm mindful of the time, so I want to quickly go through the summary. I just wanted to say container flows are complex. They involve multiple border crossings, multiple handovers of control, multiple modes of transport, multiple actors. The container operator, my member companies, have very little direct control over or access to the containers, except in the container depots. But as I tried to illustrate, not all containers will go through a container depot, meaning that they will not necessarily be inspected, let alone cleaned. Next slide, please. I just wanted to point to this best practice guide that we have developed in the IPPC's Sea Container Task Force. Next slide, please. Where you will see that we actually took this complexity of the container supply chain and tried to identify touch points, interchange points, where somebody has custody of the container and that somebody can do something in terms of reducing pest contamination. And we had listed container depots, the pack point, that is where the exporter, the shipper will pack the container, export terminal, import terminal, transshipped terminal, and the consignees. All this to say that in the Sea Container Task Force, we have, of course, realized and tried to address that the fact that there is no single solution, there is no simple or single solution on how to ensure that a container and its cargo is clean. I think I will stop here in the interest of time. I know I had one or two more slides, Maribel, but if I may hand over to the next speaker, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. It indeed is a very, very complex system, and only through good cooperation are we going to manage to effectively deal with this situation. Our next speakers are Wendy Belts and Wendy Asbell. Wendy Belts is a Field Operations Director for the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection and Quarantine, which is part of the United States Department of Agriculture. And Wendy Asbell is the National Manager for Invasive Alien Species and Domestic Programs for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Wendy's, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, I want to thank you for bringing us all together today to have this important conversation. Next slide, Wendy. So containers in North America come in every day, thousands on both coasts, and then they get on trains or trucks and they go all over Canada, US, and Mexico. And the problem with that is a lot of those containers are contaminated with pests of concern for us. Next slide. So here are some examples of different pests that can contaminate both the container and also the cargo. And when we talk about cargo here, most plants and plant products are regulated by most NPPOs. And we're really looking at the non-agriculture cargo. So tile and steel and machine parts, stuff like that, that can also harbor pests and are kind of overlooked because it's not pulled in for an agriculture inspection. So here you can see snails and slugs can definitely crawl aboard. Flying insects can fly over or in lay their eggs. Capra beetle, weed seeds get stuck in the cracks and crevices, and also in the reefer units for refrigerated containers. Plant debris and soil in and of itself is not necessarily a big deal, but it's the pests that they harbor. So diseases that can get on plant material, or nematodes and weed seeds that can get in the soil. And then of course there's other contaminants, straw, spiders. Every country has different others that they're concerned about. Next slide, Wendy. So again, the plants and plant products, at least here in the US, we regulate and have criteria for what can and can't come in. And it's really the non-plant and plant products that are often not regulated under our plant protection legislation that can bring in the insects and diseases, or the insects in the soil that bring diseases that we're concerned about. Next slide. So contamination can happen for many reasons. It could be, where the container is coming from, the time of year. It could be a flight season for flying insects. The pest biology, it might be the time of year for the larvae to turn into adults and then they crawl on board. The packing area, are the containers set in soil, or are they on cement as they're waiting to be loaded? Is there a lot of vegetation around the area that are, have the pests inside of it and they're just waiting for the opportunity to fly aboard? If the containers are being loaded at night and there's lights on, that they definitely attract the moths, the wind and the rain. Packaging, a lot of times the pests can get on the cargo and then the cargo is wrapped up in cellophane and that just holds the pest in. And a lot of these pests aren't necessarily on their first trip. They might have come aboard the container, a year ago. Like Capra beetle can last a long time, and they're just waiting for the right opportunity to come out of their hiding, or the right person to sweep the crevices of a container to find the weed seeds that have been lying in wait in those crevices. Next slide. So there's, you know, reasons, and I think we all have general reasons why we're really concerned about this. The negative impact to agriculture and the forestry sectors. Here in the US, our ash tree population has just been decimated by the emerald ash borer. And I think every country has their own emerald ash borer that they can talk to. The cost to manage an infestation is very high. If we can catch the pest at the beginning, then the cost is low. But as the pest gets established, the cost to maintain it and try to eradicate it, and then if you can't eradicate it, then you're just managing it, and the costs just go up as we move through that cycle. And then, of course, it affects trade. There's pests that we don't want here because we have a big export market, and if we were to get a pest established, then we have other countries that also don't want that pest, and now that we have it, we have restrictions on what we can export. And then for industry, there's regulatory actions. The cargo could be delayed, and then you're paying the demurrage fees. You could pay for a treatment of that container, or at the very extreme, you have to re-export the container and the cargo is not allowed in. Next slide. So this is, like we've said at the beginning, this is a global concern. It's been a concern at the IPPC for over 10 years now, concern of the contracting parties. So about 5 years ago, the IPPC put together a sea container task force. And initially the task force was to look at what's called the Ctu Code, or the Packing of Cargo Transport Units, which is a guidelines that industry uses to move containers. And there's a lot of information in the Ctu Code, but there's also an annex in there that talks about contamination of a container, and if somebody is handling a container and they come across contamination, what they could do. So we were initially asked to measure the uptake to see if people are really starting to use the Ctu Code, and they're seeing that annex about contamination, and we're seeing the reduced rate. But we've struggled collecting data. Here in the US, USDA is not at the border. We have our own border services agency, and I think many countries do. And so it's been a struggle. We do collect a lot of data here in the US, and we collect all of our pest data is collected. So all the pests that we intercept, we identify and we have that data, but our problem is we can't tell when that pest is associated with the cargo versus the container. So it's been a struggle for us here. We've been promoting some industry container cleanliness guidelines, and I think James will kind of show you what industry has developed to show their cooperation, and they're really wanting to help us mitigate this risk, and so some things that they've put into place. We're engaging other MPPOs. We're talking to you here today to see if there's anything that we're doing that you can use, and to hear what your concerns are and your challenges, and maybe there's some things in place that that you're doing that we haven't thought about. And then creating a lot of outreach material, which the Sea Container Task Force has developed a couple of things. This is the last year for the Sea Container Task Force. We end in 2021, so just in a few months. This year has been a strain because we're supposed to have our last meeting last November. And because of COVID, we weren't able to meet. And so IPPC decided to extend the task force for another year, and we've been meeting virtually for this past year. CPM is supposed to meet in 2022, and kind of they've posed some questions for the Sea Container Task Force to answer. And so we're working on those, and then the CPM will kind of talk about it and decide, you know, a way forward. Is a standard what needs to happen? From what we're seeing, there's not a one size fits all. Every country is different. Every country has their legislation issues or their resource issues. And so it's not going to be a one size fits all. So would it be more some guidelines? And so kind of a menu of things. And as your country, you can look and say, okay, this one fits best for us. And this is how we can help mitigate the risk of pests in our country. Again, outreach to MPPOs is what we're doing now. And there's consideration of an international workshop similar to what we're doing here today, but to hopefully bring in countries from around the world to sit down and talk and have these conversations to see what's working and what's not working and a kind of a way forward. Next slide. And going back to Lars's slide, this is kind of the outreach material based on that last slide that Lars showed. This is a document. It's posted on the IPP, on the IPP, and it gives you all the touch points that a container can go through, and then what kind of cleaning can be done at those touch points. I think it's a really handy tool. And if anything, it shows you all the different spots that a container goes through. So again, go to the IPPC website and the information is there. Next slide.
Right. Stemming from the objective of the IPPC to look at complementary options to promote and monitor sea container cleanliness, the United States Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as the National Plant Protection Organizations took up the charge of the IPPC to promote sea container cleanliness and develop complementary options that might be considered before considering imposing any mandatory measures. And in recognizing that government cannot do this work alone, we formed the North American Sea Container Initiative with industry partners such as the World Shipping Council, Global Shippers Forum, Freight Management Association, Container Lessors, and many other partners. And we're very pleased that in 2020, Mexico's Mppo joined the North American Sea Container Initiative and are encouraging Mexican industry participation. And that's really quite significant, so that we have a truly North American approach. And what I really want to point out is this is a voluntary government industry initiative. And what it means is that industry and government are working collaboratively to raise the awareness, to educate and motivate participants along the supply chain to ultimately help reduce those pest risks that are associated with sea containers and their cargoes. All of the members of NASCI are there because they want to be, and they're all interested in seeing what alternatives there might be to more prescriptive regulatory measures in tackling this very, very large and complex issue. And again, I can't stress enough, Wendy has mentioned it, Lars has mentioned it, we really need the industry perspective and input to ensure that whatever solutions are proposed are going to be feasible along the supply chain and still meet the NPPO's mandate for plant protection. So just a word of what we mean by industry. It's all parties involved in the supply chain in North America and beyond. Mr. Kerr has outlined the complexity of global container movement and logistics challenges. And for us, it includes all of those touch points and all of the people involved with the container, whether they're using it all the way along its journey from being built all the way until it's retired. And And again, although there are certain key intervention points for phytosanitary checks and cleaning, everybody plays a role in ensuring that those things actually happen. So some of the objectives of the North American Sea Container include those on the screen, but they're fairly simple. It's really to better understand how containers move in North America and globally, particularly what we can do here to protect other countries from contaminated containers and cargo originating in North America, and how we protect our North American plant resources from imported or transiting containers. We're also looking at what helps or hinders a party in the supply chain, and in NPPOs for looking for pest or soil contamination and taking action on those finds. And we had focused a lot of our early efforts, and are continuing to do so, on education and outreach to our respective stakeholders, to various organizations and industries, to say that cleanliness matters, and clean containers and clean cargoes are good business and result in lower costs to industry and government. And wherever we can, we are promoting the government industry voluntary approach to other countries and regions as one important way to achieve our collective goal of reducing the spread of plant pests. And over the past 4 years, NASCI has worked within North America and beyond to engage various industry sectors and government organizations with the main goal of creating awareness and fostering collaboration. We've worked with such industry groups on guidelines and understanding their programs for cargo, such as the Italian ceramic tile industry's Good Phytosanitary Practices program, which is an excellent example of how industry has stepped up to promote clean cargo. And we're very grateful to NAPPO for hosting our outreach materials and other information on the NAPPO website. The link is shown here. If you go to the NAPPO website, to the Sea Container Initiative page, you'll find a lot of excellent information that are available for anyone to access and use. And that includes an infographic, frequently asked questions, and a very simple yet educational video. So what are we doing now? What are we continuing to do? We're recognizing the diversity of parties along the supply chain and the potential actions that each could contribute toward keeping cargo and containers clean. We had planned to host in 2020, along with the World Bank, an international meeting for container and cargo logistics stakeholders to focus on how to involve all those parties that were depicted in a previous slide, including the packers and exporters, importers and unpackers. Sadly, like many things, COVID restrictions made that not a possibility, but we're still determining when and how we might have such an industry-focused workshop in 2022. But since 2020, we've been having information sharing sessions such as this one, but with industry sectors to promote sea container cleanliness and gather perspective on what's already being done in various parts of the supply chain. Trying to figure out what are the existing practices, how can those be integrated into a voluntary system? What kind of obstacles are the various parts of the industry encountering, or what do they anticipate regarding problems with phytosanitary checks or cleaning? And what are the suggested measures that can be taken, or how can they influence those to mitigate those plant health risks? And it will all depend on their role in the supply chain. We really want to ensure that logistics considerations, operational practicalities, and challenges are clear. And the information that is exchanged with industry is going to be used in further analysis of what suite of things are possible along the supply chain and what measures, either alone or in combination, could contribute to achieving our goal. And in that regard, we're continuing to work with other NPPOs and associated government organizations such as border agencies, transport agencies, and so on, to determine what can be done. And as always, we continue to expand international awareness and potential adoption of this type of voluntary initiative. So overall, what we found in the Sea Container Initiative in North America is that if we work together, not just in North America, but globally, we can actually succeed in minimizing those risks. We can better identify pests and contaminant risks and mitigate them, sharing ideas to do that. We want everyone to be aware of the issue and do their part, however small or big that might be, to help in the pursuit of cleanliness for cargo and containers. And that's adopting those best management practices such as the industry cleaning guidelines and checklists, sharing ideas such as we are doing today and will continue to do, and continuing to spread the word that container and cargo cleanliness counts. So in conclusion, no one organization can solve this issue alone. It's a long-term endeavor. We've seen great value in working together toward our ultimate goal of minimizing risks to our global plant resources from contaminants moving in or on sea containers and cargo, and at the same time, facilitating safe and efficient trade. So with that, thank you. We'll have opportunity for comments, questions, and discussion later in the session. But if you have any questions about what you've just heard, please don't hesitate to contact us at this generic email address, and please mention containers in the subject line so your message shows up very, very clearly. And lastly, here is a list of some resources that you might find interesting to peruse. And with that, we will turn to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy Aspel and Wendy Belts. That was an excellent presentation. We now will have a presentation on container hygiene programs a little bit further away from the Americas. And for that, we will have Zina Waghorn, who is a manager invasive species in the Ministry of Primary Industries Biosecurity, New Zealand. And Rama Kari, who is the director for a hitchhiker working program for the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Zina and Rama, welcome, and please take it away. Sorry, Zina, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. I pushed one button, not two. So just like to echo the thanks for the organisation and the and welcoming us to this webinar, and for the excellent organisation and for all of the participants and showing their interest in what is actually a very global problem. So next slide, Rama. I'd just like to give a bit of history. Here in New Zealand, we've been managing the importation of sea containers for about 20 or 30 years, depending on how you want to see how we write our standards. We've had a standard of some form for sea container importation since the mid or late 80s, but the real standard the one that we see today came into force in the early 2000s. As a result of that, our border agency at the time started looking at containers and started seeing a whole lot of contamination that we would otherwise have never seen. So prior to this program, which we established in 2005, there was a whole lot of contamination on sea containers, specifically those from the Pacific. This is because of the logistics chain in the Pacific Islands, and has resulted in contamination being present on the inside and the external surfaces of a container. We used to have about 40 to 50% of contamination from those countries on the internal and external sides of a container. And as a result of that, New Zealand took a 100% interest in every container that arrived from the Pacific, and it meant that there were high intervention costs that included decontamination, cleaning, and in some cases, the denial of discharge or the requirement to re-export back to those islands. Next slide, please. The kind of contamination we saw were those species associated with the islands. So we have things like the giant African snail that is unfortunately now present in the Pacific Islands. We had a lot of soil, grain, and plant material because of the nature in which those containers and all those containers were present. I apologize, I'm at home with my two young, very children, so it's a bit interesting. So as we had also a significant number of snail detections, which made it quite important that we looked at every container. And we had different size snails, so we had the juveniles and we had the whole large adult African snails present as well. Next slide, please. As a result of the heavy intervention and the large cost to the industry, a shipping company approached New Zealand in 2005 and asked to set up a framework where they have a system that we go in and audit and approve that would enable a faster movement of sea containers into New Zealand. This first approval was through Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and proved to be very, very successful, and rapidly the contamination rate started dropping. We saw an overall drop of about 99% of contamination on containers from these systems, and ants, which was a big problem from those islands, dropped down to less than 1%. Our program was so successful that Australia officially joined the program in 2010, and we now run a joint system that has approximately 12 systems. Next slide, please. The benefits to Mppo are multiple. The biggest benefit I see for the system is that the risk is managed offshore. We don't even run the risk of having these species arrive on our shore. It saves MPI particularly around $500,000 a year in eradication programs that we had for container terminals to manage the presence of ants. And it has dropped the rate of inspection for the containers from these islands by about 95%, which has freed up our resource to prioritize other commodities. And it also has created a very strong working relationship with the industry in the Pacific nations and with our counterparts in Australia. Next slide, please. The benefits to industry are equally important. We have much less congestion at our ports from these islands. We have a reduced demurrage cost. We have reduced arrival inspections. We don't have anywhere near as many treatments and cleaning costs, and the reduced delay in discharge and clearance. And one shipping company now has a tangible increase in the number of consignees that they can have in any 1 year. And in addition to that, anecdotally, the industry has told me that they save tens of millions of dollars a year. Next slide, please. So we currently have 12 systems spread across 6 Pacific nations, and that has reduced the contamination rate by over 99%. It has reduced time and costs for both the MPPOs as well as the shipping lines and the importer and exporters. There's a stimulation of employment and awareness of biosecurity across the Pacific nations, and it contributes to the reduction of pest movement in sea containers. Next slide, please. Over to you, Rama.
Thank you, Sina. And firstly, many thanks for the opportunity and for extending the invitation to the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, and for the opportunity to present on the joint Australian and New Zealand initiative. The rest of the presentation, we are going to look at how the actual system is set up, just in 3 or 4 slides. So the system involves a range of industry-led offshore activities and government-led onshore activities. So the system is mainly set up on around the terminal itself before the containers are placed on board a vessel. And the first step involves the site preparation, which is about controlling the pests and their habitat reduction around the site where containers are stored before they're placed on board a ship. So as part of the system, the containers are cleaned inside and out. And cleaning involves not only sweeping, but also washing. And once the containers are cleaned, they're sprayed with residual pesticides. As Sina mentioned earlier, from Pacific Islands, the main risks associated with container surfaces are contaminants, including soil, plant, and animal material, ants, and snails, particularly giant African snail. So to manage the risk of the ants risk, the containers are sprayed with bifenthrin and that remains effective for several months, even after spraying. So it prevents recontamination of the container from ants infestation before the containers arrive in Australia or New Zealand. In addition to spraying the containers are then stored in a cleaned and treated areas, dedicated storage areas prior to shipping. Again, this is generally done near the terminal or within close proximity to the terminal. And the areas are also snail baited to prevent recontamination with snails. And once the containers are cleaned and treated and stored in a clean designated areas, they're also labeled, indicating that they have been subject to or processed as part of the sea container handling system. So as part of the government-led onshore activities, we monitor cleanliness through on-arrival inspections. We provide feedback to industry on the compliance rates, and we conduct, so based on the outcomes of the inspections, on-arrival inspections, the intervention rate will be decided accordingly. Subject to ongoing compliance, the intervention rates can be reduced from 100% initially to as low as 5%. So if the compliance is maintained, the inspection rates will remain at 5% as compared to doing 100% of those inspections. We also conduct offshore audits, that is to make sure whatever controls that are implemented offshore and documented in the quality manuals are being followed. So we undertake, depending on the compliance rates, those audits are conducted either 6 months or where with high levels of compliance, we do it annually. Whilst the sea container hiring system is an arrangement with industry, where industry lead the offshore component. When I said industry, the system can be set up by shipping lines. In fact, most of our arrangements are with shipping lines, but in some cases, any third party can set up this system and provide those services to interesting participating shipping lines. So a third party quality system can offer that service to multiple shipping lines, shipping those containers from that particular terminal. But this arrangement can also be entered with an NPPO. We have an arrangement with the Mauritius NPPO, where the offshore quality controls are actually overseen by the participating NPPO in the country of export. So it's not the shipping lines. NPPOs we can enter into arrangements with the participating NPPOs as well. Unlike the sea container hygiene system, where it's mandated to have the cleaning and washing and treatments with bifenthrins and snail baits, the actual controls can be tailored to the pest status of the port. For example, if the main contaminants from a particular port or from a particular country are only contaminants, then the controls can be to wash and inspect the container surfaces instead of applying the chemicals and the snail baits, etc. So depending on the pest status and the risk status of the containers arriving from a particular port or from a particular country, the offshore controls can be tailored accordingly. I'm happy to take any questions after the session, but that brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zina and Rama, for providing that excellent presentation on your container hygiene programs. Our next and last speaker, before we hear from all of our participants, is Mr. James Hookam, who is the director of the Global Shippers Forum, and he will provide us the industry perspective on the issue of sea containers. James, please go ahead. I believe you are on mute, James.
My apologies. I'm just trying to share the screen and see if we can get to the opening slide, which I thought I had set up. There we are. I'm hoping you can see my presentation. Well, good evening to everyone from London. My name is James Hookam. I am a director of the Global Shippers Forum, and may I, like my co-speakers, extend my thanks to the organisers for inviting this perspective on this important topic from the cargo owners, the owners of the cargo that is carried in the containers that we have been discussing, and a party which the Global Shippers Forum speaks on behalf of from over 25 countries around the world, across the continents, and represents the views of cargo owners in multiple arenas. But we are also in particular represented on the Sea Containers Task Force that you have been hearing about, as well as participate in the activities of NASCI that you have also been hearing about. And as the representative of the cargo owners, we fully acknowledge the critical role that shippers play in addressing this key issue, which is under discussion today. We would certainly associate ourselves with many of the concerns, many of the sentiments, and many of the hopes and expectations that have already been expressed, in particular by my friend and colleague in the industry, Lars Carr. What I am going to try to do in the next few minutes is try to express how we are addressing this important issue from an industry perspective, although I stress the views that I actually give you are those of the GSF, although I do know that many of them are shared by my industry colleagues. So I hope that it has become very clear to everyone today that the container shipping industry recognizes the importance and the urgency of the issue of the risk of transfer of invasive species through the sea container pathway, and the urgent need to address this and to try to reduce this risk in the future. This is something that is relatively new to the awareness of the industry. It has been talked about and discussed in many forums, but it needs to be urgently raised as an important issue right across the industry. And I will mention how we will aim to do that in a later slide. But I think has also become apparent from the presentations that you've heard, the movement of cargoes in sea containers around the world, international trade is a really complex situation. And it is, the more you investigate it, the more complex it becomes. And as Lars was showing earlier, there are multiple actors in multiple locations performing multiple functions under multiple legal jurisdictions. It is an extraordinarily complicated system that has emerged in a relatively short period of time. And interventions and proposed interventions by international agencies and by governments do need to be approached with extreme caution, given the sensitivity of the industry to disruption and dislocation. And one of the key points we are advocating in our interventions with the IPPC and in other fora is that any measures that are being considered to address this problem should be carefully risk assessed. They should be proportionate to the risk that is presented and should be targeted at the higher threats of species and the higher risk cargoes. And I think you've seen in the presentations so far as well how a proportionate, targeted and risk assessed approach can generate cost-effective results. And it is this philosophy, this approach, which we would advocate to CPM as it considers what interventions it should be making in the future in this area. It's important we understand there are real costs and potential impacts to the mandatory cleaning of all containers. A requirement is being discussed which might demand the mandatory cleanliness of all containers prior to being loaded on board ships. This would severely restrict the availability of clean containers, limiting export opportunities and potentially impairing economic growth. As cargo owners and shippers and those parties that are responsible for the packing of containers, we would also recognise that container cleaning at a large scale would also consume very significant amounts of energy, significant volumes of water, and have a high use of hazardous chemicals. And we are not certain whether the scale of this usage has been properly evaluated in assessing these interventions. And I think has already become pointed out, mandatory requirements and interventions into the sea container pathway is not always available in all jurisdictions around the world. Different legal systems, different practices, different arrangements prevail in different countries. And therefore single global mandatory measures may not be able to be made effective in all parts of the world. And whilst we recognise the urgency and the importance of this issue, I have to say that the overwhelming focus of my members at the moment is clearly coping with the crisis in world shipping that has emerged following the global health emergency. And the lessons that are being drawn from that, I think, demonstrate the sensitivity of world trade to container availability and port throughput capacity. So this is an area which demands careful consideration, careful management before mandatory measures are introduced. Not that there's any shortage of guidance and information to help packers of containers and the cargo owners that I represent to understand what needs to be done. And here is but a selection of the documentation which is available. We start on the left with a key document which has been mentioned by a number of other speakers, the IMO, ILO, UNECE Code of Practice for the Packing of Cargo Transport Units, the Ctu Code. This is the definitive source of guidance for the industry on how containers should be packed, and it includes key sections which also include measures that can be taken to avoid contamination of containers and cargoes with invasive pests and mitigate the risks of those being transferred. There's important guidance which we've seen elsewhere already from the IPPC itself, and industry itself has collaborated together. The document on the right is a document recently produced by key organisations at a global level involved in the supply of containers and movement of containers in the market to give clear industry guidelines on the standards and methods for container cleanliness and the avoidance and prevention of pest contamination. More recently though, some of those organisations, including the Global Shippers Forum and the World Shippers Council, have come together and worked in partnership in the Cargo Integrity Group. So this is an informal group of those global organisations specifically focused on addressing the issues of cargo safety and including addressing the challenges around prevention of pest contamination. We have recently produced a summary of the Ctu Code, a quick guide, which takes the key messages from the Ctu Code, supplements them with a range of illustrations and diagrams, and condenses the 200 or 300 pages of the Ctu Code into about 30 pages of key points that is more easily digestible by container packers and other parties that need to understand those important messages. And we have also taken those key messages and summarized them into a container packing checklist, which is illustrated on the right here. Consists of about 35 questions, which if answered affirmatively, will mean that a container has been packed in accordance with the requirements and the specifications of the Ctu Code. This has no legal status, but is simply a convenient way of summarizing what should be observed by those that are packing containers, and it helps them to record the results of their inspections and their actions, and perhaps even to use as evidence in passing along the supply chain in order to reassure other parties that they have acted responsibly when packing that container. It covers both the principal safety aspects, but also has key questions at the appropriate points in the checklist, which check for measures taken to prevent pest contamination and risk of transfer. Now, the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice that these are actually Spanish language editions, and I'm very pleased to be able to say that in the very near future, we will be announcing the availability of the quick guide and the packing checklist in the 6 principal languages of the United Nations. But that is likely to take place and become available by the end of this month. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have had an advanced preview, an advance notice of the availability of what we hope will be a useful and practical guide to help improve the standards of container packing. I close with, I think, a series of statements and sentiments which are shared amongst the industry, and I think are key points that we would hope are borne in mind by regulators as they make progress on this issue. One of the key learnings I hope that has come from the contributions that the industry bodies have made to the Sea Containers Task Force and indeed to the NASCI initiative is that we have knowledge, we have information, we have experience that we can bring to bear to help understanding of this industry. And therefore we would ask regulators to work with industry stakeholders, whether at global, regional or national level, in the development of any new measures they might be contemplating. We believe that there should be a prioritization of activity and interventions with high-risk pests, high-risk trade routes and cargoes, and these should be addressed first in order to gain experience and understanding. And likewise, we have heard some very enlightened initiatives described by national governments, and we believe that these are important learning opportunities so that these experiences and understandings can be taken forward in the development of any further global measures that might be contemplated. But whatever regulatory action might be considered, we are firmly of the view that the real key to success is a wider education and awareness raising exercise with all the parties in the supply chain about the importance of avoiding pest contamination. We believe that a key party in this are the packers of the containers, the entities that are physically responsible for placing boxes, loading boxes, packing boxes into the containers, either manually or by mechanical handling equipment. These are the individuals, these are the entities that have direct experience and sight of the interior of the container. And they need to be educated about the importance of checking for pest contamination, knowing what to look for, where to look for it, and most importantly, who to call, who to report to if they find contamination in their container. So our request, our plea is to MPPOs and the IPPC to partner with industry in advancing pest transfer mitigation, whilst allowing the continuity of trade at this very important time for the whole of the global community. And with that, Stephanie, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, James. We greatly appreciated receiving the perspective of the shippers that use the containers that we are discussing this afternoon. Let me just say a great thank you to all the presenters this afternoon. I think all of our eyes have been opened to the complexity of the issue before us. Now is the time when we can have a discussion with those of you that have joined the webinar. And for that, my colleagues, Wendy Aspel and Wendy Belts, will lead the discussion section. We do have a few questions already in the question and answer option at the bottom of your screen. They are in Spanish, Wendy Aspel and Wendy Belts. So we might want to see if our interpreters can give you the translation. If not, I would be happy to help in that respect.
I'm the interpreter. I will translate the questions into English that appear on the chat.
Thank you very much.
Which phytosanitary measures apply when one finds a container that is contaminated in the internal part, and which ones are contaminated outside? So the first question, like we were saying, is made by Marlon Estuardo Vilela Pinto. And once again, what phytosanitary measures are applied when finding a container that is contaminated in the inside of that container? And which ones Let me read this again.
Which,
So what phytosanitary
which
measures are
measures are
applied? Yes.
which measures are used
inside
on the
and outside? Yes, I think there's a mistake in the question and they mean internal and external. Go ahead.
Thank you for interpreting that. I would say it really depends on the pest as far as what measures are taken. Here in the U.S., if it's a pest that we have a treatment for, so like a snail or like an egg mass, then there'd be some sort of probably methyl bromide fumigation. Same with the outside of the container, also for an insect pest. For a seed, the containers are thoroughly swept on the inside. If it's determined that they can't really mitigate the pest, then it would probably be re-exported. It also depends on if the pest is actually in the container or if it's in one of these cargos that we've been talking about that's not a plant or plant product, and then how that cargo is packaged. So if it's wrapped up in cellophane and the pest is inside the cellophane and the cargo is floor stacked instead of on pallets, and so you can't get the circulation of the methyl bromide, then it would also need to be re-exported. Here in the US, we have pests that are considered highly mobile. And so if it's not a highly mobile pest, a lot of times still allow restacking of the container for treatment. But if it's considered a highly mobile pest, and the risk of reconditioning the shipment is a greater risk than treatment, then it would have to be re-exported. And Wendy or Stephanie or Athena or Rama might have other thoughts.
Yeah, it's the same in Canada. It's pest dependent, and like in the United States, we will sometimes just re-export, send a container out of the country if it's something that is a high risk. The outside and inside, we do have levels of risk that we look at, particularly in our in-transit program. So again, it goes back to the mobile pests and things that might, like seeds and so on, that can be dealt with that way. Or if fumigation is possible, then we would use that. But for us, it doesn't really matter if the pest is on the inside or the outside. We would still take some action on the pests as well as on contaminants like soil.
So in New Zealand, very similar to the US and with Canada, it's all pest dependent. We have an array of treatment options depending on the pest, of course. We have heat treatment, we have fumigation, and for the external surfaces, depending on what the pest is, we enable decontamination through sweeping or water blasting as well. So in a very similar way to the US and Canada, depending on the pest and its mobility, if it's high mobile, high risk pest, we close the doors of the container, and if it can't be treated, it gets re-exported.
And it's the same in Australia, Rama Carey here, where the risk can be managed onshore to an acceptable level. We will manage the risk. For example, if it's just contaminants that can be easily removed from the container, we use similar treatment techniques, whether it's removing physically or applying, like washing the container.
Gracias, Wendy. Esa pregunta.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That question had a follow-up question, actually, which is the following. they would like to know if the response can be targeted for those cases in which the detected pest is of quarantine interest, or what happens if the pest is of quarantine interest.
I would say it's still the same action. It's pest specific as far as the type of treatment that can be done, whether it's highly mobile or if it's in such a, or if there's just no way to treat it, then the same. For us, if it's a quarantine pest, we're going to take some action on it. If it's a non-quarantine pest for us, then it depends on the level of infestation. So if it's some sort of like corn seed that's on the bottom of the container, because corn seed can also harbor pests once planted. So if it's a high level of infestation, then an action will be taken. But for all quarantine pests, some sort of action, there's not really, for us, there's not really a level of quarantine. We either have an action or no action. And I see, Lars, you have a question from before, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. First of all, if I may be allowed to make the obvious point that container operators, and I would include also, if I may, James, beneficiary cargo owners, those James represent, we are not experts. We are not scientists. So to us, and the advice that we are giving in the Ctu Code, but actually also in the IPPC best practice guidance, it is looking for visible pest contamination, what we can actually see with human eyeballs, not pathogens, viruses of that nature. And then in both the IPPC guidance, in the Ctu Code, and in the joint industry cleanliness guidance that James showed, that we took the lead, the World Shipping Council, in developing, we provide, should I say, general non-pest specific measures, such as sweeping, vacuum, or wash the containers before packing to remove potential contaminants. And there are other very practical steps. Don't keep a container under bright lights while you are packing it. But I think at the most pertinent advice we are giving is that if the container depot or the packer has questions about what to do, they should contact the local office of the NPPO, or if the contamination is of animal origin, the local animal quarantine office. They are the experts and they should be consulted, we urge, so that they can give proper advice. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Lars. And I would agree with Lars. For industry purposes, when talking with industry, we want them to, we don't want them to be, like Lars said, they're not scientists. And so if they see a snail, we don't need them to send it off to see if it's a quarantine pest. We just need them to mitigate that risk or notify their local agriculture office. And every country has their own list of pests of concern. And so, the containers travel all over the world. And so for industry advice, we want them to look for contamination that they can see. Sina?
Hi, I just wanted to add to what you've been saying in regard to that question. New Zealand's regulation is written with that in mind, that we don't expect or require anybody but the NPPO experts to be able to identify what is actually contaminating the container. So the way that our rules are written is that we require the container to be clean and free of pests. And that means anything that shouldn't be there. So when we talk about quarantine pests, it's at that point we choose or determine which treatment is most appropriate, rather than requiring that container to have the contaminants ID'd before we take an action. So if we receive a container that is contaminated with soil or plant material or has an ant in it, and we're not sure of the species of ant, then we action regardless to remove those, to ensure that the container can move rapidly, and that no holding or holding back of the container from discharge or from release of the port is done for identification, because sometimes it can take weeks if you need to do molecular identification of the species.
Thanks, Zena. And I would say here in the US, our regulations also state that containers need to be coming clean and free of infestation. We do have the benefit that we have identifiers around the country. And so normally identification of an insect can be done either within the day or within 2 days. If it's like soil or plant debris, that automatically gets cleaned. If we don't wait to see if there's pests in it, it automatically gets cleaned. But for insects, we do identify them, and if it's a non-quarantine pest, then we just let the shipment go. And if it's a quarantine pest, that's when a treatment would be involved.
Perdón, un comentario en cuanto a
I
la-
would like to ask a question or just make a brief comment. Those participants who wish to speak, I ask that you raise your hand, and when you do so, we will enable your microphone. There is a question on the chat by Ezequiel Ferro. Maybe Ezequiel Ferro can just turn on his mic so that he can ask the question directly. And also Stephanie Bloom has requested the floor as well. Just those three comments.
Thank you. I do not need the floor anymore. I was going to mention the question by Ezequiel. Thank you very much.
Hola, ¿me escuchan bien? ¿Se escucha?
Can you hear me?
Bueno, gracias,
Yes.
muy amable. Bueno, Ezequiel Ferro, de la ONPF de Argentina. Un gusto poder escuchar las experiencias de todos los países que están disertando hoy. Me parece que un poco la consulta que yo tenía ya en parte la representante de Nueva Zelanda respondió, al menos desde la perspectiva de su país. Tal vez sería bueno conocer en el caso del resto de los países lo que tenía para consultarles, que es en el caso de que se detectaran plagas contaminantes, ya sea por oficiales o por
pests by the industry. The question is first, there are actually three questions that I have. The first one is if you take any measure or immediate action in the case you detect a contaminating pest. The second question is if that measure depends on, for example, the incidence, the level, the amount of contaminating pest that is detected, as you wish to call it, or whatever term we use. And finally, the final question is, does the measure or the action taken only apply when it is a regulated contaminating pest, or for any type of pest, regardless of what it is, if this is conditioned by the second question that I asked? Thank you very much.
So I'll start. I think each country has their own procedures. So for us, we have our lists of regulated pests that we take action on. And so if the pest comes, if a container comes in and it has one of those pests listed, then action is taken. And the action is dependent on the pest. If it's in, we described earlier how the pest comes in, if it's inside of a container of goods that, or even on the outside of a container of goods that cannot be fumigated with methyl bromide, we tend to use that mostly here in the US, then that container would be re-exported. But we don't have, for our regulated pests, we don't really have a level of infestation. If it's 1, then it's 1, and if it's 10, then it's 10. We still would take action on that. And then I don't remember what the third question, but I'll let my other colleagues answer to their countries.
Go ahead, Rama.
Thank you. Here in Australia, it's the same as in New Zealand. It takes sometimes weeks to do the identification of the pest. So we focus on managing the risk immediately. So it really depends on the nature of the pest and what kind of treatment is appropriate to manage the risk. But also we take into account, depending on the nature of the pest, for example, if it is highly mobile ants, whether the action applies only to that particular container, or whether we need to take broader action given the highly mobile nature of the ants, whether we need to apply or look at other containers on the ship more broadly to see if there's a widespread contamination. So it really depends on the biology of the pest, but generally we take action immediately. Most of our biosecurity officers are trained in terms of the inspections and identifying the pest, way to detect, etc. Not necessarily trained to the extent like an entomologist, so they are not trained to do the pest identification to see whether it's a regulated pest or non-regulated. That's done by our entomologist, but by the time the pests are identified, in some cases it can take weeks. So the immediate focus is about managing.
I concur, and New Zealand does the same thing.
Yes, in Canada as well.
Thank you very much, colleagues. There are no more questions on the question and answer session. I wonder if we want to ask our participants to raise their hand if they want to have a discussion or share an opinion. I'll leave it in Wendy Aspel and Wendy Beltz's hands. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. I just wanted to say we do have a post presentation survey, and so it's just 3 questions, and it's in and around the presentations, asking you, information that you received today, and if it was useful to you. And then there's also a way that you can, if you want more information or you want to reach out to us to talk with us one-on-one, then that question is in there also. And I think Wendy was going to put it in the chat, and then I was hoping that the coordinators of the event could, actually, I think it was in the flyer, maybe it wasn't in the flyer, if it could be sent out afterwards to get some follow-up feedback on our presentations.
Certainly, and I see there is a question on the chat, not on the question and answer, from Roberto Manzanero, and his question is, do your countries have regulations specific to container cleanliness to mitigate against pest introduction, which makes it mandatory, or is it addressed under other procedures?
Here in the US, we have regulations that all conveyances, including sea containers, have to come in pest-free.
And that is the same in Canada. So the actions taken are based on our Plant Protection Act and regulations. So it can be a container, a maritime vessel, it could be somebody's shoe or knapsack. If it has a pest, plant debris, or soil on it that poses a risk, then action can be taken.
Any of the other speakers want to address that point?
Rama has his hand up.
Oh, yes, Rama, please.
Thank you. So that's the same in Australia. It's a requirement that all the imported containers, whether they're full, empty, or regardless of the type, whether it's FCLs or LCLs or reefer, they must be free from pests and contaminants. But the way we approach the intervention at the border is risk-based. We look at the intervention data, and we classified a list of countries as high-risk countries based on the approach rate, where we find high levels of non-compliance from those countries. Those are the ones that we target. More recently, we have implemented measures in light of increase in CAPRA detections. So we have implemented mandatory offshore treatment for specific containers, but that's again a risk-based response. So general requirement is they must be clean, any container, but our border intervention is based on the approaching risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. I see Lars has his hand raised. Lars?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. If I may, from a container operator perspective, one of the challenges I have is that when I try to go to events, when we could that, or now webinars, and I speak pest contamination, then I will hear an exporter, a shipper say, oh, I don't need to worry about this because I'm not exporting agricultural products, or I'm not exporting plants. So the challenge I am having, and therefore I would be so pompous as to suggest that also the challenge that all of you on the call have, is that pests are, as Wendy and Wendy's clearly demonstrated in their presentation, pests can originate in any type of cargo. I think you showed marble blocks, Wendy, in your presentation. And so in addition to, it's not only agricultural products, it's not only regulated pests, it's anything, even just mundane soil that is of a concern. And that to me is a challenge I would be suggesting we all have in getting that message across. I don't know if my good friends and colleagues in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, US would agree, but I'm just conveying to you the challenge I'm always facing when I give speeches about pest contamination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. I mean, that certainly is a struggle that that we have here in the CFIA, and getting that message across for a lot of things. For example, people feel that if they are maybe not aware that if they're moving, let's say, from Ontario to British Columbia, they really need to check their moving van and all their outdoor household goods for the presence of egg masses and other things, because people don't always think of pests as traveling on inanimate objects, whether it's a steel pipe or a slab or a container. And I think that's why this kind of webinar, and particularly the engagement with the industry, is so important to keep bringing that message up. And in fact, in the CFIA, one of the things we're working on is how do we make that message clearer for people coming to our website or wanting to know about things, just so that it kind of closes that loop. But thanks for corroborating our sometimes difficult situation in explaining that it's not just logs or plants for planting or apples. It can be anything. And if you are giving that message out in your meetings and so on, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. There are a couple of other comments on the chat. First, everyone, Wendy has posted the post-webinar survey links, so please take note of that. Then there is a comment by Eban Hutton wondering if the recording of this session will be available to all participants. And I guess we would need to know if the presenters will allow us to share their presentations and if IICA can somehow share the recording. Thank you.
Si los expositores están de acuerdo.
If the speakers agree, we can share the recording for sure.
I will agree.
Likewise.
Yes, please do share.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy for it to be shared.
Yeah, same with me.
Excellent.
Same with me.
Thank you very much. And there is another comment on the chat from Mariela Villalba, and her question is, in cases where you cannot re-export the container, can you proceed to the destruction of the container, a rather drastic measure?
I would say here in the US, we've never destroyed a container. We have had it to where, and it depends on if the pest is on the outside, because if it's on the outside, then we certainly don't want it to move. But if the pest is on the inside of the container and the container can be sealed, we have worked with our neighbors in Canada and Mexico when the pest is not a concern for them, and been able to ship the container to their country, and then the cargo, the broker has to do something with the cargo in that country. But that's very rare, and we've, as far as I know, we've never destroyed a container for treatment.
Zena?
I'm sad to say that we have destroyed containers.
I just saw your hand up, Zena, so
Yeah. No, yes, so we have destroyed containers. It is the measure of last resort. So we're at the bottom of the ocean. There's nowhere for us to go. If there's no vessel that can move that container, then we try every possible way to find an alternative. And if we can't, depending on the nature of the pest, then we do destroy the container. It's not a preferred option at all.
Thank you, Zena. A couple of additional comments came in on the chat. The first one from Renata Croci, who says, thanks everyone for this activity. It is very important for us to continue a dialogue among all of the actors in order to effectively be able to control these pests. And another comment from Patricia that says, I am commending the organizers and presenters of this session. Very informative, timely, and relevant. Another thank you from Mariela, and then we have a comment from Eric. Hi for the people from New Zealand and Australia about the measures you take on washing, cleaning, and applying of certain pesticides. How do you deal with possible environmental impacts associated with those activities?
Thanks. That's a very good question. Not many people ask it. We have very stringent environmental rules in New Zealand, which means that where we have facilities that are approved to decontaminate a container and to treat or to fumigate or to treat the container, that they have very strict environmental rules that they must comply with a different government agency. So where we wash a container, for example, there are filters in place and catchments, and the water goes through a filtration system before it's released. So, and then the solids or participants are put into a specific waste disposal section of our waste disposal systems, where they have no way of being released into the environment. In terms of fumigation, we're trying very hard to follow the Montreal Protocol. It's becoming, as we're all aware, very difficult to recapture and that sort of thing. So we work very hard not to use methyl bromide where we don't have to. And we do have alternatives like heat treatment, which will I don't think it's that effective on seeds yet, depending on the species, but it definitely does get all the insects. So, and then obviously the specimens are dead and they can just be disposed of.
Thank you very much, Zina. Another comment or question on the chat from Vladimir. His question is, how are cases handled where you might find a quarantine pest in a container and the importer abandons the cargo because they don't have the resources to pay for treatment costs?
So here in the US, and I don't have a lot of specifics around it because we have had this happen, they've put some legislation in place to where we can recoup the cost of whatever is needed, whether it be, usually if the cargo is abandoned, then if the container is abandoned and here I can't think of a pest that could not be treated in some way, either fumigation or we don't have heat treatment here, but cleaning out the washing or whatever the container. If sometimes there's cargo associated with that container, and it would be very similar. It would probably be fumigated at the highest level. Again, we tend to use a lot of methyl bromide here in the U.S., but we do try to stick with the Montreal Protocol. But going back to the original, we have legislation in place to reclaim money when we can. I'm not sure how it works though.
Okay, lots of information coming in on the chat. A comment from Roberto Manzanero saying this is timely and an important aspect in exclusion of regulated pests. Thank you. A follow-up to Zina's response concerning fumigation. What about phosphine fumigation instead of using methyl bromide? Can you comment on that?
We're currently always investigating alternatives to methyl bromide. I know we use sulfurfluoride and that we are in the process of examining the efficacy of phosphine, especially on some of our more frequent pest detections. So yes, we're definitely working on it.
Thank you very much. Another question from Mario Vega concerning how can one guarantee that the contaminants that have phytosanitary consequence are not affected in the country of, in the importing country? Is there a specific place where one should do the inspection in order to mitigate this situation?
I'm not sure about my colleagues in other nations, but we try very hard to have all this work done prior to arrival in New Zealand. It is the most cost-effective and most practical and effective way of managing pests. So if we are to think of some of those situations as well, we on arrival have infrastructure set up in a specific way so that when a container is opened up and it does have these pests and they're highly mobile, that they are not in a location that would make establishment easy, that there's no food sources nearby, and that it's generally a highly industrialized environment. So it reduces the probability of establishment and makes treatment or containment of those pests a lot easier also.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it's the same in Australia. Where possible, we try to manage the risks offshore before the containers are placed on board a ship. But when it comes to onshore controls, really depends on the nature of the risk. If it is associated with the external surface of the containers, we try to manage those risks before the containers leave the terminal. But if the risks are associated with internal surfaces or with goods inside the container, then they can be managed at appropriate facilities, even if they're located outside the terminal.
And here in the U.S., the cargo is, for the most part, inspected at the port of arrival. And if a quarantine or a regulated pest is found, then it is treated at that port before it's allowed to move any further into the U.S. We do have shipments that go in bond with the amount of cargo that comes in and the space available. And I'm not sure how our border agency determines what cargoes they allow to go in bond and what cargo has to be inspected. I don't believe any agriculture products are allowed to go in bond past the port of entry. But if it's a non-agriculture commodity like car parts or steel, a lot of times they're allowed to go in bond to their destination, and they go to in bond warehouse, which is controlled by our border agency, where the inspection, not always for agriculture, is done, but they go through all the processes. It might be a paperwork check or whatever, and sometimes it's an inspection of the container at that location.
Thank you, Wendy. There's a comment from Lisa Perino that says, Lars's point about eliminating all contaminants is important for that reason, because a common non-regulated contaminant in one country may be a regulated one in the country of destination. Great. Suddenly the chat has gone quiet. So we still have a few minutes. If not, I will turn it over to Wendy Asbill and Wendy Belts for closing.
Perdón, Stephanie, antes de ir al cierre.
Sorry, Stephanie, before we go ahead and give the floor to them, could we ask all participants to switch their cameras on? We'd like to take a photograph of the event.
I'm sorry, my video is not working for whatever reason, so been trying, but it's not.
I am there with the dog and I haven't blinked in an hour and a half.
Really nice.
Ok, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're very happy to have been here to have this discussion, and I just would like to ask the attendees and participants if they have any ideas or views that they would like to share before we close out. Because all input and ideas and things that you might do in your own countries are quite valuable for us to know, to see what is happening. So if you think of something that you would like to share or have an idea in the middle of the night and want to provide that to us, we would be very pleased to to receive any information you have on what you do or what you might need, and work with us for working with your industry, working with other countries or so on. We're very happy to participate with you.
Yeah, and I would agree. You know, this, like we said, this is definitely a global issue, and every country has their challenges with how to deal with it in their country. And hopefully we can all work together to come up with some solutions that, you know, it's not going to be a one size fits all. It's going to vary from country to country. There might be a couple of things that you can do in your country that, you know, maybe we can't here in the US or other places. So we're hoping we can come up with some ideas. You know, they're having the conversation at CPM in 2022. I don't know when the decision will be made on the path forward, but it's definitely, we need to make sure that everyone that we can talk to help them to understand the issue and talk through what their challenges are. So those discussions will happen, and we have a solution that works for, I mean, I don't think you have a solution that works for everybody, but for the majority, we will have a solution. So again, I thank the coordinators of this, and I think it's been a great session, and I appreciate Sina and Rama joining at very early hours and James coming in the evening. So it's very much appreciated, and I think all the presentations worked really well to really paint the story.
Thank you very much, Wendy. A few other comments in the chat. Thank you for an excellent webinar from Fars Khan. From Yesenia in Ecuador, just some information that in the last couple of years, they have worked on effective disinfection because of Fusarium oxysporum. A comment from Samantha that says containers could be accompanied with proof of treatment that can be viewed from port to port to help each country determine where each container falls on or out of the safe radar. If anybody would like to comment on that. If not, Vladimir says, thank you for the invitation. Excellent webinar.
Permiso, Stephanie, solamente desde el IICA.
Yes.
Desde el IICA, comentar que fue para nosotros un gusto tener la oportunidad de organizar con ustedes este webinar, un tema que consideramos de mucha vigencia y de mucho interés, especialmente para los países de América. Y entonces agradecer la oportunidad y agradecer el interés y tanto de los participantes como de los expositores, especialmente los que tuvieron que madrugar para participar o quedarse hasta muy tarde. Muchísimas gracias a Shixbe, a NAPPO y a NASCI por la oportunidad.
Thanks, everyone. This is Stephanie again. A few other thanks from Vladimir Ovalle. Thank you for the invitation. From Samantha, appreciate information from all of the speakers. And from Marlon Estuardo Villela, congratulations on the topic and excellent participation from all speakers. From Eric von Quedno, thank you for the opportunity to know about your experiences. It was an eye-opener. Well, on behalf of myself here at the NAPPO Secretariat, and on behalf of all of the RPPOs of the HICSFI, and there are 5 of us, we want to thank you for your attention this afternoon. We will work with our partners at IICA, hopefully to make available not only the presentations, but the recording of the session. So you can help all of these experts from the industry and from government spread the word. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon. Good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
And good night.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Un
Good
especial,
Bye.
un especial agradecimiento a las intérpretes por el trabajo realizado y al área de tecnología de la información del IICA, especialmente Ricardo, que han estado velando por el éxito tecnológico del evento. Gracias, Ricardo, y gracias a los intérpretes.
Indeed.
Gusto,
Yes,
doña
thank
Lourdes,
you.
excelente.
Thank you. Goodbye.